When you think about the endgame for World of Warcraft, what do you think about? For me, it's raiding. When I started playing the game about 7 years ago, a friend of mine wanted me to raid with him, which resulted in him swapping servers every 2 weeks before I could reach level 20. With that off of my chest, let's talk about dungeons. I'm going to explain why I think the game does make an effort to teach new players how to play, but these efforts are not consistent when it comes to exposing them to dungeon content and does not appropriately prepare them for what is to come. For the sake of brevity, I will focus on the first 60 or 70 levels worth of content. I might analyse content past that point at a later date. Does World of Warcraft teach new players how to play the game? Short answer, yes. Long answer, no, not really. You have one ability when you create a new character. Generally, you use this ability on monsters around you until you get another one. Curiosity should drive a player to test out these abilities and read their tooltips as they come, so they can eventually build up a rotation. A chain of abilities to make a player as effective as possible for doing what their chosen class does. Without too much hand-holding, a new player has learned plenty just by experimenting. After a few hours of questing, a player will be a high enough level to do a dungeon. For all intents and purposes, we're going to assume that newer players gravitate towards damage-dealing specializations more commonly than the other roles, as most if not all classes start as one. The things that a new player learns while they quest may not be entirely transferable to dungeons when it eventually becomes time to do one. A player is taught to use their abilities in a safe environment while questing, but they're not often given a chance to use crowd control and other non-damaging abilities in a dungeon, almost being discouraged from doing so. Without too much intervention from the other party members, newer players are taught early on to stay behind the tank, keep the healer alive and do as much damage as possible, but this often leads them to follow the tank around without really paying attention to what's going on, until they've been led through a dungeon by the nose without learning anything. The tank tends to be the one that picks up the slack for players in this regard. They pick up groups of enemies and hold them until the damage dealers kill them. Rinse and repeat. It's like a shooting gallery of ducks for the other party members. And if a damage dealer does make a mistake, the healer in the tank can resolve the problem before the player realizes that they have done something wrong. In a way, damage dealers are not punished for not paying attention. A flaw of the role-based system is that some roles are more active than others. It does not put new players in a position where they can learn what to expect from the game, which is done rather well later on. Trash mobs in much later dungeons and raids often expose players to mechanics similar to the bosses that they'll be fighting. New players don't often get a chance to use their crowd control abilities early on. Often enemies are unaffected by most of them, as being fought by the tank breaks many, if opponents weren't outright immune to begin with. Splitting up groups of enemies or using any non-damaging abilities that could be helpful can quickly solidify the idea that they'll never be useful, and using them is a flat-out loss of damage. Almost every class gets something that could be useful in a pinch, and if they don't, they should. But while questing, a player might find very little use for it and would be unprepared to find application for it in a dungeon. Even then, there are often scarce few opportunities to use crowd control, since it's only really necessary if somebody in the party makes a mistake, or the encounter they're fighting spawns an ad that can't be immediately picked up by the tank, which are almost non-existent up until this point. I think that players aren't consistently engaged enough. A damage-dealing character often doesn't have to do anything besides follow their rotation, encouraging tunnel vision, reducing how useful they could be to the rest of their party. It doesn't help that if they do make a mistake that they're unlikely to learn from it, as a tank can taunt alerted enemies that they have pulled off of them, and a healer can keep them alive if they're standing in a dangerous area that's dealing damage to them. One could argue that these skills aren't required for the leveling experience, and that is true to an extent, but there is no reason for prior content to be filler that can be completed without thinking. It encourages an absent-minded playstyle and does not prepare players for what is to come. There's no reason not to encourage the development of a player's spatial awareness as soon as possible. What would be a good way to teach these players about the game mechanics? I've talked a lot about standard dungeon monsters up until this point, and there's a lot that could be said about them, but they're often not as impactful to a player's learning as unique boss monsters are. I feel it's important for more of the bosses to incorporate mechanics that encourage interrupting, positioning, and adjusting for patrols, as well as reward players for using abilities and strategies outside of their rotation. The funny thing is, the game does do this at the start where it's less punishable to ignore these mechanics, and not later on when you would reasonably expect the game to expect more from the player. They just don't test the player enough. Here is a list of dungeon content. There is something that you might notice after looking at this for a little while. The date added column there over on the right. Many of the earlier dungeons have been updated at some point, with more modern design principles in mind, and some have been altered more than others. Here are some notable mentions of dungeon bosses that new players might want to pay attention to. In Razorfen Cruel, Groyat the Blind Hunter will shoot an AoE that will split into many smaller ones that will radiate outwards, and Chalga? Razorflank will summon totems that will pull opponents in and shoot fire at them that has to be avoided. A new player that has done dungeons as they've unlocked them would have done 10 whole dungeons before they're challenged to a boss that really makes them focus on their positioning while doing damage at the same time. Razorflank is a light version of this, forcefully moving your character while shooting completely avoidable bursts of fire in your direction. It's good to see these principles incorporated into older, updated content, but I don't think they're featured enough up until this point where multiple bosses per dungeon start to demand some form of movement from the player. This is about as mechanically taxing as dungeons get. Even if it's not a very difficult fight, I think it's a decent level of putting all of the party members in danger while allowing them to use their positioning to stop themselves from taking unnecessary damage. Unfortunately, this level of mild mechanical intensity doesn't continue from here when it comes to boss fights. Almost everything else on this list suffers from what I mentioned earlier. Most of the fights here are just tank and spanks that don't encourage players to do anything most of the time, and most of them are part of outdated content. Instead of the newer design principles where players can maneuver their characters to avoid taking damage from certain abilities, they take damage unavoidably so the healer is kept busy, while the bosses are scaled up to hit harder. While the difficulty is raised on paper, the demand for movement that the first 30 or so levels asked for just isn't present. It only serves to encourage players to return to being absent-minded damage dealers, where this is where they should be tested against this sort of thing. If I'm not mistaken, players aren't expected to get out of a boss's line of sight to avoid an attack until Talon King Ikis at level 65 in Sethak Halls. And you'd be surprised how many players don't know you can hide behind something to avoid a ranged attack in general. I think if the game has to resort to flashing "get behind something" or "this boss is casting a spell" up on the screen, maybe it hasn't done all it can to teach a player how to position themselves early on, or at least hasn't established a proper, easy-to-understand telegraph for certain attacks. How many hours of gameplay is there into the game? It took me 2 days to reach level 70 with the new scaling system in place, and that's 48 hours and not a weekend. If a player hasn't been exposed to a broad array of mechanics in that time, what's going on? Though it might be worth noting that I played as a High Mountain Tauren and started at level 20, so only 40 levels. It's because the dungeon experience is a mess that might need a full rework. And whether we like it or not, World of Warcraft is a patchwork monstrosity of materials that are a product of their time. So what would I change if I had the chance? There are a few points that I can think just off of the top of my head. Don't shift the burden so much in leveling content. If a player fails to move out of a mechanic that calls for them to be wary of their positioning or to interrupt a boss, don't just deal damage to that player. Dealing damage doesn't punish a player as much as stunning them would. Being stunned is a very high visibility punishment that can't be missed, whereas losing a little bit of your health can go unnoticed entirely. Not to mention that this places the burden on the healer to fix the problem. It can get annoying, but I feel it would get the point across. Encourage the use of crowd control early on and give players access to their interrupts as soon as possible. Maybe include a mechanic where a certain mob has to be hit by multiple interrupts or CCs. Imagine an enemy has 2 stacks of a buff and is casting something that might impede your party, and hitting him with a CC or interrupt will remove a stack from them. Losing 1 stack makes their cast much slower, so a second player can realize what's going on and hit their interrupt as well. And they can be rewarded by dealing extra damage to that opponent by breaking their focus. Make more of the damage that bosses and enemy monsters deal threatening to the whole party but avoidable. Encourage movement, positioning, and spatial awareness from every party member. There's no reason for any boss to be a complete cakewalk that you can beat while alt-tabbing and writing a lengthy rant about dungeon design. Establish more universal, consistent telegraphs. Instead of flashing what a player should do on the screen like get out of the way or hide, a symbol should appear above their heads when they have to avoid a certain mechanic. Maybe one for when they're being charged, so they can turn the boss away from the other party members. Maybe another one for when they need to hide behind something, and maybe one for when they need to stack up with other party members, just things like that. While these do exist throughout the game, for some reason they don't feature very often in earlier content. Why not? It's a lenient environment where they can ignore mechanics, at least give them the opportunity to connect the dots by themselves. And also remove Gnomeregan. For reasons. Dungeoning throughout World of Warcraft is a fun experience, but it could be made better if the older content bosses were made more engaging and asked more of the player. A universal, baseline change, such as level scaling throughout the older instanced content, won't fix what's already built on outdated design principles that don't arm players with information and skills they need for the endgame. I mentioned raiding at the start of this video, and for me that's what the endgame has always been, personally. And I've always considered dungeons to be like small raids. They should progressively become more difficult and test your abilities as a player until you're ready for more difficult content. I understand that World of Warcraft is fragmented into a series of expansions that each have their own individual levels of self-contained complexity and directions of design, which only makes universal scaling make less sense. If a player that has consistently done dungeons doesn't know how to keep an eye out for patrols and not to run into a pack of ghouls by the time they get to Stratholme at level 50-something, maybe the fault doesn't lie entirely with the player. If you want a player to learn a skill, that skill has to be consistently tested in order for them to retain it, otherwise it's just a gimmick that they will soon forget. Like the flame barrels in Scarlet Halls or the mailboxes in Stratholme. The game seems unsure of what it wants for the first half of it, and without proper manual tuning it will probably remain that way. I leveled through the first 50 levels of dungeons as a tank before writing the script for this video, making my High Mountain Tauren level 70. There were the highest highs, the lowest lows, and no shortage of postman-based harassment. But while gathering material and writing, I often thought to myself, does any of this even matter? And I might just be looking too deeply into completely avoidable old content, but maybe it's a sign that the old content needs to continue to be tuned and patched in for a more consistent leveling experience.